The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome back again, Helene Harrison. Welcome.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for having me back again.
Oh, you're always so much fun to have on the show. So I'm excited today to talk to you about a subject that I feel like is talked about a lot, but maybe not in great detail, or I guess maybe I've never done an interview on the great matter. Everybody knows about Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and Katherine of Aragon, and they're like triangle, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it comes up a lot, but I don't know how much people actually know about what happened.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to talk about today, I think, is just trying to get a good understanding of it a little. And I know you research Anne Boleyn a lot, so that
Yeah.
that will give us a different perspective, too. I think a lot of the times when we talk about the great matter, we look at Katherine of Aragon's side a lot more. So how do you want to start this today? Maybe we should just... Let's start off by just talking about the great matter in general before we go into detail. Like, when we say the great matter, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because a lot of people see the great matter as Henry VIII's divorce from Katherine of Aragon, which largely took place in the 1520s, early 1530s. But Henry VIII wasn't actually asking for a divorce. What he wanted was an annulment of the marriage as if it had never existed, which is interesting because we do so often see it as a divorce case, which it wasn't. It never really was. So there's a sort of a great misconception over it, really, right from the beginning. And Henry's case for his divorce sort of hinged on a passage in Leviticus in the Bible, which said that if a man marries his brother's wife, it's an unclean thing and they shall be childless, because, of course, Katherine of Aragon had previously been married to Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur. The marriage lasted only about 6 months before Arthur tragically died, very young. He was only 15. And then Katherine was sort of put into this almost no man's land of widowhood for sort of 7 years, while her father and her father-in-law fought over the dowry, over her betrothal to Prince Henry, as he was then. And then when Henry VIII came to the throne, he married Katherine. Almost the first thing he did as king was to marry Katherine. And then we have this sort of tragic decade where Katherine just has miscarriages, stillbirths. We have the one surviving child who becomes Mary I, Princess Mary. But it's really just this tragic period, and Henry starts to wonder, why can I not have a live son? They did have a son in 1511, but he only lived for around 7 weeks, which is a very short life for this little boy. And yeah, the crux of it is that Henry starts to wonder, why can't I have this son? And he bases his whole case on this passage in Leviticus, and he reads childless to mean without sons. He doesn't count his daughter as a potential heir.
I love how he cherry picks what he wants out of it, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. There's definitely an element of that with Henry. He just takes what he wants and leaves what he doesn't want, because there's also a passage in Deuteronomy which says that if a man dies and leaves a widow, his brother should take that widow for himself and have children to carry on his brother's line. But Henry just goes, no, don't believe that one. I believe Leviticus.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
obviously he goes that route because he has his own ideas of where he wants to go next.
Yes. So in the 1520s, we don't know exactly when Henry sort of first has these thoughts, but certainly by sort of 1526, he's started to make moves towards getting the marriage investigated. 1526 is sort of the earliest we can place any actual movement towards an annulment. Although there have been earlier suggestions, I think around 1514 there was a question over the legitimacy of the marriage.
Oh.
But it was just sort of brushed aside. I think it was one of the English churchmen, might have been Warham off the top of my head, but don't quote me on that because I can't quite remember. But yeah, there are earlier suggestions over potentially the legitimacy of the marriage. But we don't see this coalesce until the mid-1520s, when we know Katherine of Aragon is past the age of childbearing. There is no chance at this point that she can give Henry a son. And this sort of coalesces into his, I don't want to say obsession, but his sort of need to have an heir, and this relationship he develops with Anne Boleyn around the same time. We don't know when Henry first develops these feelings for Anne. There's a lot of unknowns in this equation that we just don't have the evidence for. But the first love letters, it seems likely around 1526. Based on some of the sort of references in it, it seems likely it is around that time. And they possibly committed to each other early in 1527. That's when Anne possibly agreed to be Henry's wife and queen. So it all sort of happens at the same time, but we don't actually know which one came first. Was it his relationship with Anne which led to him requesting an annulment? Or was he already thinking about an annulment, and then the possibility of marrying Anne became the catalyst for him acting on it?
Yeah.
So we're not sure which way round it falls, and different historians have different ideas of what came first and when his relationship with Anne began.
Yeah, I think that's the complicated part of this, because everybody wants to put the blame on Anne, right?
Yeah.
It's Anne's fault that Henry thought these things. But really, the big picture of this is, I think this is not spoken about often enough, is that the reason why Henry so desperately wanted a male heir is likely because the Tudor dynasty was so new. I mean, his father was the first Tudor king. Imagine the pressure that Henry VIII had on his shoulders to make sure that this dynasty continued.
Yeah, and I think there's also, England hadn't had a crowned regnant queen at this point. There was no precedent for a woman to rule. The closest we get is Empress Matilda in the 12th century, and London closed its gates to her rather than let her be crowned.
Yeah.
So we have no precedent at this point for a female ruler. And Princess Mary I would be the first crowned and anointed female ruler. Jane Grey obviously wasn't crowned, didn't last long enough on the throne to be crowned. So there's just this lack of precedent, and the fact as well that Henry believes he needs two sons. Henry was a second son. He knows it's easy for the eldest to die. So that's why we see, even after Jane Seymour provides him with a son, Henry keeps remarrying in hopes that there will be a Duke of York, a second son. So yeah, Henry has a lot of pressure on him. He's seen his father and his mother produce these hordes of children. They have sort of 4 that survive into semi-adulthood. Arthur obviously dies early, 3 that survive into full adulthood. But there were a lot of child deaths. There was a son, Edmund, who died, daughter Catherine, who died. So Henry's aware that children don't necessarily always survive, but I don't think he expected that all but a single daughter would die, because Catherine did have a lot of pregnancies in those years. And it's just very sad that none of them, apart from Mary, actually survived.
Right, right. And then Anne came into the picture
Mm,
and she was younger than Catherine. And I'm sure he thought, oh, here we go, right? I have this younger woman.
yes.
She surely can provide me with the male heirs that I so desperately desire. But that didn't quite work out, did it?
No, it definitely didn't. And I think that's partly what's so shocking about Anne Boleyn's rise and fall is that Henry spends sort of 7 years, more or less, trying to marry Anne and fighting pretty much everyone he could fight. Um, there's threats of international war because of this divorce case, annulment case. And yeah, so Anne has this sort of great rise. She's sort of she's the daughter of a knight who descends from, a Lord Mayor of London. Her mother obviously is descended from the Dukes of Norfolk, and her father does have descent from the Earls of Ormond as well. So she's not a great commoner. She does have this noble blood, but no one could have foreseen that she would become a Queen of England. And particularly with sort of the fights that Henry had to put up with, Catherine of Aragon had very powerful support in her nephew, Charles V. The Pope obviously caused a lot of problems by not granting the annulment, but he spent a large portion of the time under the control of Charles V, which complicated things for Henry greatly. And he's fighting against his own church and his own people to get Anne crowned queen. And then when Anne is crowned queen, she gives birth to a daughter. Henry expected, they'd been to see physicians, astrologers. Everyone had predicted Anne would have a son, although I don't think anyone would have risked saying, no, we think it's a daughter.
Right. Yeah.
Everyone was going to predict a son. So she has Elizabeth, and it is a healthy child. She does live. And then we know Anne had at least 2, possibly 3 miscarriages. She seems to have miscarried in 1534 and January 1536. There are suggestions she was possibly pregnant again in 1535, but there is little agreement on that one. Again, there's suggestions in some of the sources, but no one seems entirely sure. So I think Henry starts to see the same pattern he saw with Catherine of Aragon. And he doesn't want to waste a lot more years waiting to see if Anne would produce a son. Yeah, and I think Anne she'd made too many enemies in her rise. She didn't have much support. So when she started making mistakes due to her fear, talking out of turn, I think her enemies saw the opportunity to bring her down.
Yeah, they sure did. In the worst way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we're coming up to the anniversary now as well. So yeah, there's a lot round about Anne Boleyn at the moment. So if people want to go into her fall a bit more, I'm sure there's a lot of things floating around at the moment.
Yes, and the month of May every year, the first few weeks is always jam-packed with Anne Boleyn stuff, which is good because I feel like we've talked about this so many times that Anne Boleyn really is the gateway queen for the Tudors. I mean, she was, as far as the Tudors goes, she was one of the first ones that I started reading about too, because there's stuff about her everywhere, right? You just go like Anne Boleyn stuff is just flooding you and you start reading about it and you just want to learn more and more and more and figure this out.
Yeah, I think the first book on the Tudors that I actually bought was Alison Weir's The Lady in the Tower, The Fall of Anne Boleyn. I think that was actually the first non-fiction history book I actually owned.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was the same sort of gateway, and for me was Anne Boleyn, so...
That's funny. I think my first one, and it was so long ago, but I think it was The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir.
Yes.
I mean, Alison really, she's been around for a long time and she is such a prolific writer. And, I recently had her on the show too. And I had to thank her because she has brought in so many people into this Tudor community because of her writing.
Yeah. Both fiction and nonfiction now as well.
I don't know how she does it. I told her that too. I don't know how you go back and forth between the two because they are both so different.
Yeah.
That's a talent. So We keep talking about annulments, and I think it's so funny that we have the saying divorce beheaded died, divorce beheaded survived, when really that's not the case.
Yes, because neither of Catherine of Aragon or Anne of Cleves were actually divorced.
Right.
So yeah, it's a weird one that we just assume that it was a divorce in the modern sense,
Yeah.
which obviously, word meanings can change, and it may well have been put forward as a divorce at that sort of period of time. I'm not no I don't know the meanings of words, how they've changed that much, but I think it's possible that if the word divorce was around then, it perhaps did mean just ending a marriage, not necessarily how we would use the word divorce today.
Sure.
But that's a bit beyond me to look at word meanings in that sort of historical sense, I'm afraid. But I think it is possible that we're using a historic word in a modern sense.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I always think of it too. Like I had an uncle who is no longer with us, but he was married back in the 60s or something, and he got an annulment. It's not like we don't know that he was married.
Yeah.
It's not like by having an annulment, it completely erases that memory from everybody's mind. So that probably has something to do with it too. I feel like
Yeah.
the divorce beheaded died. I guess I have to look at the origins of that, when that became the phrase. It's probably the
Yeah.
Victorians.
A lot of things seem to descend from the Victorians. But yeah, I don't actually know when the first use of that phrase is. It might be something interesting to look into.
Yeah, yeah. Well, both of us. Let's both look into it and see what we can find out. Okay, so back to the great matter then, since that is our topic today. So
Yes.
Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon for a very long time. She does not provide him with a living male heir, not even one. He's looking for two. He meets Anne
Yeah.
Boleyn, and we still don't know if he started the process of the great matter before or after he met Anne. But how did that process get started? Can you tell us that? I want this episode really to be for people who know nothing about this. Like, if you really don't know anything about the Great Matter, you're new to the Tudors,
Yeah.
help them understand what this would have looked like, or who Henry put in charge to help him get what he wanted.
Yeah. Well, this is something that I'm looking into at the minute for my next book anyway. And I'm trying to look at a timeline of when we might see Henry begin to think this way, not just when sort of we see the legal wheels come into motion, but when does Henry start to think this way? And for me, I think it comes down to the birth of Henry Fitzroy in 1519. We don't
Oh,
see the legal wheels start to turn then, but I think it's when we really see the seed of doubt in Henry's mind, because at that point he realizes he can birth a live, healthy son. He at that moment goes, it's not my fault that I don't have a son. This is Catherine's fault, because he's proven that he can have a son. So I think that's sort of when we start to see this seed of doubt in Henry's mind. But of course, Catherine is pregnant at the beginning. By 1518, Catherine is pregnant for the final time. Obviously, she won't know it's the final time at that point,
yeah.
but Henry does still have these hopes that Catherine will produce a son. Whereas by the mid 1520s, we know that Henry stopped sleeping with Catherine probably sometime around 1524, 1525. Judging by some of the sources and the letters that we have surviving, it seems by the mid 1520s, Henry has stopped sleeping with Catherine, which is also, I think, when he starts thinking about an annulment, is probably around 1525, when he knows that the only way he's going to get a son is if he marries again.
Yeah.
So we start to see sort of the legal wheels start to turn in 1526, when Henry tells Thomas Wolsey that he wants an investigation into his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And we have Wolsey setting up almost a private court at his residence to talk to the bishops and the archbishops about Leviticus, about whether the marriage was legal or not, but they don't reach an agreement at this point. And this is when we sort of then see it explode into public. We have this sort of private court that Henry didn't want Catherine to know about. He wanted to keep it private, but she does seem to have discovered it. So it's likely one of his supporters in court got wind of it and told her. But yeah, so that's sort of when we start to see the first legal wheels is 1526 into 1527, which of course is also when I think at least that Anne Boleyn accepts Henry's proposal. Which is where the timeline gets a bit squiffy as to what came first.
Was the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, the problem is that the love letters, of course, aren't dated. So we're working off little clues within those letters to try and figure out when things happened. And no one agrees on which order the letters come in, let alone what dates they date to.
That's the difficult part with research, isn't it? Especially if they don't. Thankfully, some of the letters that I have been looking at for Thomas Seymour's stuff will say the date at the end, which thank goodness, because then at least we have some idea. But there are others where we don't know the exact date, and then you try and make assumptions, and that's hard.
Yeah, well, I mean, the love letters seem to be dated anywhere from about 1523 to 1529. There's this massive sort of period where they could be. Although most people think they were probably between about late 1526 into sort of towards the end of 1528. Most people place them somewhere within that period.
Well, right. When did Anne Boleyn get the sweating sickness? Was that 28?
Yes, that was summer 1528.
Okay.
So we know we can date some letters to that period because there's mentions of the sweating sickness. So we can date those ones within a couple of months. But there are others that we've just got nothing to go on as to when they were.
And clearly it was early on in their relationship, because once you're in a relationship for an extended period of time, you don't normally write each other letters like that anymore.
This episode is brought to you by Heyday. Feeling stressed? Take a moment for yourself with Heyday. Stroll through rows of golden wheat, tend to cute barnyard animals, and discover the joys of a digital farm retreat. You don't have to hop in a car or catch a plane. Escape to the farm at the tap of a finger. With Heyday, you're not just tending to a farm, you're tending to yourself. Heyday. Search Heyday, that's Hay space DAY, in your favorite app store. Heyday is a free-to-play mobile game and offers optional in-app purchases and random rewards.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Yes, and there's a lot of sort of trying to figure out when Anne Boleyn was at court, because if she was at court with the king, the letters wouldn't be dated in that period.
Yeah.
So if we know, because we know after the Blackfriars trial in 1529, Anne was pretty much always at court. So the letters are going to date prior to that period when she was back and forth from court at Hever. So that's why we can date the majority of the letters to before that period, because after that she was pretty much permanently at court.
Okay, that makes sense when you think of it that way.
Yeah.
I often wonder, if Wolsey had any idea how difficult this was going to be. Like, do you think he went into this thinking, oh, this will be no problem? I feel like I'll be able to get the king the divorce that he wants, and then realized he couldn't.
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about, because there is a small precedent with popes granting annulments. We have a French king who got an annulment from his wife who retreated to a religious house. We have Henry's sister Margaret asks for an annulment from her second husband, which the Pope grants in the 1520s. And Henry speaks out against her getting an annulment, and then within a few years is asking for his own annulment, which seems a little hypocritical of the king.
Oh, Henry.
So there were these precedents, and I think there was a chance that Wolsey could have got the annulment, but the international situation just played out against him because Charles V was Catherine's nephew. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, so he's one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time. And he was engaged in wars with Italy. So he managed to, he sacked Rome, essentially took the Pope hostage almost. So, of course, the Pope wasn't going to grant the annulment of the Emperor's aunt's marriage when he was in the power of the Emperor. So I think the international situation was just completely negated any chance that the Pope was going to grant the annulment at that point. Maybe if Henry had asked for it a couple of years earlier, perhaps it might have been easier and the Pope might have granted it. But I think just the timing was horrendous in terms of everything else that was going on in Europe at the time.
The cards were stacked against Henry. And the fact that he was such a hypocrite with his sister, I just think that's karma coming back to get him, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, the timing, I think, of the Great Matter was everything, really, as to why it sort of failed.
I feel like one of the things we don't talk about very much is Anne's feelings towards the process. Is that something that you're able to find in the records? Is there anything that indicates how she felt while all of this was going on?
The sense we get, because there's not many letters from Anne that do survive. We have she added a postscript to a letter to Wolsey. We have Henry's letters to Anne. We don't have Anne's responses to Henry. But reading the love letters from Henry, you get a sense that even sort of fairly early on in the Great Matter, like the late 1520s, we see Anne is getting very frustrated that things are taking so long. She's agreed to marry Henry. Henry obviously is desperate to make Anne his wife, but there's all of these sort of political things that are holding it back. And the Blackfriars trial in 1529 was just an absolute disaster for Henry and for Wolsey. And it was something that I think Henry and Anne had built a lot of their hopes on, that this would resolve the matter. But of course, it then dragged on for another nearly 4 years after that. And, Anne, by the time Henry and Anne marry, Anne is probably over 30 years old at that point. And she would expect to have been married at this time and have already had children. So I think there is a sense that Anne feels her time's running out, that the longer they wait, the less likely it is that she can provide the son that Henry wants. Yeah. So I think there is a fear before she's even married. There's already this fear that she won't be able to do what the king wants. And of course, at that point, she can't imagine that she'd end up beheaded. But, she sees how the king treats Catherine. And I think there's a fear that he can treat her the same way. And she knows she doesn't have the same support that Catherine does internationally. So she's not going to have these powerful people fighting for her. So I think we do get the sense that Anne's very frustrated that things are taking so long. But there's also an underlying sort of fear that I think Henry picks up on, because he tries to soothe her and sort of tell her, this will happen, you are going to be my wife and I love you. And it's just, we constantly have in the letters Henry sort of saying, why are you talking like this? And there's a lot of questioning, I think, between both of them as to trying to soothe each other, but also trying to make some progress.
It's such a complicated time, because when you look at it, a big picture, it's the story of a love triangle. Katherine of Aragon clearly still loved Henry VIII. Yeah. Henry probably had love for her, but wasn't in love with her like he was with Anne Boleyn. And the Blackfriars trial, which you had mentioned, was really such a coup for Katherine of Aragon. Can we talk about that and why that was so important?
Yeah, I think because the Blackfriars trial probably comes about 2-3 years into sort of the Great Matter in legal terms, sort of when Henry first started looking at it. And it had taken this long to sort of come to court. And this is where, although there had been sort of rumours and things in public that Henry was trying to annul his marriage, and there were lots of rumours flying around, particularly within London and court circles. This is the first time we really see it explode into public because it is being put on this public stage. The foreign ambassadors are reporting on it. So we have it really becoming international. Catherine has contacted Charles V before to say that Henry's trying to annul the marriage, but it's the first time we really see it go really public in England, and people are coming to watch it. They're gathering outside where it's taking place, and Catherine only appears on the one day of the trial, and she gives this sort of really impassioned speech to Henry, sort of declaring that she has given him children. They're not childless. They did have a lot of children, although God had taken them from the world. And she sort of declares herself Henry's true wife, that she'd never lain with his brother, which is often sort of the crux that I think the Great Matter is sort of condensed down to is, was Catherine and Arthur's marriage consummated?
Yeah.
Because if it wasn't consummated, there's an argument that it wasn't valid, in which case would Leviticus apply if the marriage wasn't consummated? So there's a lot of time spent debating over whether Arthur and Catherine's marriage was consummated. And, witnesses are called who were there at the time, who heard Arthur say that he'd been in the midst of Spain on his morning after his wedding night. So we have these witnesses being called, but Catherine, after giving that initial speech, refuses to return to the court. She tries to get the case revoked to Rome, saying that only the Pope can decide on the matter, despite the fact the Pope had appointed Cardinal Campeggio to oversee the trial with Wolsey. Catherine knew she wouldn't get a fair hearing in England. So she's constantly fighting, and Charles V is, trying to get it recalled as well, to have the Pope decide the matter. And eventually the court is sort of put into recess because the papal courts in Italy were going into recess for the summer period. So because the court in England is seen almost as an outpost of the papal courts, Campeggio can close the court off for the summer recess, and it just never reconvenes. So it ends without a verdict being given either way.
Right. So then Henry is still stuck. He's like, I still need to get rid of Catherine because I so desperately need a male heir. So once he's stuck there, what's his next move to get this to move forward in the direction that he wants?
Yeah, well, Catherine had sort of provoked a lot of public sympathy with her sort of speech at the trial. So I think Henry starts to realise Catherine's got the sort of popular support here, but it's not going to stop him from trying to get his annulment. So he sort of turns on Wolsey. He sees Wolsey's failed him in this, because Wolsey had promised him that the Blackfriars trial would give him the outcome he wanted. And of course it hadn't at all. So we see Henry turn on Wolsey, and it's quite gradual, really. We often think of Wolsey's fall as very sudden, and he is quickly stripped of the Great Seal, his office of Lord Chancellor, and by the end of 1529, he is indicted on charges of praemunire, which is exercising foreign authority in England. So effectively, Henry's accusing Wolsey of using the Pope's authority over his own authority, which of course Wolsey is a cardinal. He's been made a cardinal by the Pope. He's the Pope's legate in England as well. That is kind of his job. So Henry just sort of turns this on his head, and it's a really old statute that isn't often used at this time. But we see Henry use it against Wolsey. But there is still hope for Wolsey at this point. Henry doesn't immediately sort of send him to prison or execute him or any of the things we see him do with, Buckingham, for instance, in 1521. His fall was very sudden. Anne Boleyn, case in point, his was incredibly sudden. But we don't see it with Wolsey, and I think Henry did still really almost need Wolsey, and he wanted him as a friend as well, because they'd been stargazing together. They spent a lot of time together. And I think as far as Henry could have a friend, I think Wolsey was a friend to the king. But he was a servant first, and I think Henry just thought, he's failed me. But it did take quite a long time for Wolsey's enemies to manage to persuade the king to actually have him arrested and sent to the Tower. But of course, Wolsey never made it to the Tower. He died en route at Leicester of some kind of illness. We're not entirely sure whether it's something sudden. But yeah, so Wolsey dies in 1530. And then there's almost this power vacuum, which we see Thomas Cromwell step into.
Yeah, it's, when we talk about this period of history in Henry VIII, I always think that Henry VIII comes off as such a pliable person. But you just said, it took some time for him before Wolsey fell from favor. But Henry constantly had people whispering in his ear to their advantage. Norfolk is probably the prime example of somebody who is constantly whispering to get what he wanted out of the situation. When it comes to the whole great matter, I mean, you said Wolsey died what year? 1530, 31?
1530, yeah.
1530. And then it seems like after that, after Wolsey is gone, then all of a sudden, we have executions of people who don't agree, right? So Henry ends up getting married to Anne Boleyn. I guess I don't want to rush forward here, because there is a period of time then between Wolsey dying and between the wedding. So before I get ahead of myself, what happened then after Wolsey died that Henry VIII could marry Anne?
Well, it's strange, because when I started researching this for the book I'm currently writing, the period 1530 to the end of 1532 is the period that I knew the least about. I sort of knew what had happened with Wolsey, and then I knew what had happened with Anne Boleyn. But sort of politically and legally, I didn't really know much about what was happening in that period. And from the outside, it looks like everything has almost stopped or slowed down, because we don't have this big public trial. We don't have all of these, accounts and letters being written specifically about the great matter. Ambassadors are just sort of reporting on odd things through these years. So we see Thomas Cromwell step into the breach, who had been in Wolsey's household. He'd been sort of raised into the job almost by Wolsey. And it's interesting, his role, because we often see him as sort of the architect of the dissolution of the monasteries, the break with Rome. But of course, that only came about because of the great matter. I'm not convinced Henry VIII would have broken with Rome if it hadn't been for the great matter and his need for an heir. I think England would have broken with Rome at some point, but I don't think it would have happened this early. So I think the two are inextricably tied together. And we do see Cromwell draft a lot of the legislation in this period that's starting to implement that break. So we have the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which I think is dated 1532 off the top of my head, which effectively means any spiritual or secular cases can't be heard outside England, which of course includes the annulment case. So Henry's obviously aware that Catherine has tried to get the case revoked to Rome, this law is to say that's not legal. The case has to be decided in England, which then leads to Henry appointing Thomas Cranmer as his more pliable Archbishop of Canterbury when William Warham dies. And yeah, so we start to see some of these acts that, for instance, stop the payment of tithes and other things to Rome. They're kept within England. So we start to see these sort of breaks between England and Rome, but it's gradual. It doesn't suddenly happen overnight that one day they're allied to Rome and the next they're not.
Right.
It's a sort of gradual breaking away. And I think in part Henry does this hoping that if he starts to do it, the Pope will grant him the annulment to bring him back to Rome.
Well, that didn't work. Oh, it failed epically.
Yes, the Pope never grants an annulment. He, in fact, issues a decree after Henry marries Anne to say that the marriage between Henry and Katherine of Aragon is valid and that Henry needs to leave Anne on pain of excommunication. He's not excommunicated at this time. The excommunication doesn't come for a few years yet, but the threat is there. And I think that really scares Henry at that point. But he's taken so much power onto himself, he's not going to go back.
Do you, honestly, do you think Henry VIII really thought through the fact that he was trying to set aside a Spanish princess whose nephew was Charles V? Did he, like, I often wonder, like, did he sit back and think this through, like, what implications this would have globally for him?
I don't think he did, no. I think he was so focused on that male heir that, and he assumed that Wolsey could do and would do whatever he wanted. And I think the shock came when he realised even Wolsey couldn't do it for him. And I think that was the moment that he realised this is not suddenly going to happen. I need to take some very big steps to make this happen. And I think Anne was quite a big influence there because she was very politically minded. And I think once she agreed to marry Henry and once that Blackfriars public trial happened, Anne couldn't go back. Even if she didn't marry the king, her reputation was in pieces.
Yeah.
There was no coming back from that. So I think at that point she put everything into making her marriage happen and just hoped that she could provide the son.
Yeah, and it's just like chaos just happened, like they worked so hard for this, and then people like his daughter Mary didn't approve, Thomas More, Bishop Fisher. I mean, these are all people. It's almost surprising that Mary didn't end up in the Tower, or, like if you look at Henry's relationship with Thomas More, it always seems to be portrayed as a good friendship. And yet Thomas More did everything that he could as the king's servant and just couldn't go against his conscience. And because of that, Henry VIII had him executed. Like, it just blows my mind.
Mary was the same. She wouldn't go against her conscience.
Yes.
But Henry wouldn't execute or imprison her. And I do wonder if there was some kind of very special bond between Henry and Mary when she was growing up. Because we see, even when Anne is pushing for sort of Mary to be imprisoned, and we don't have any direct evidence, but there's certainly suggestions that Anne was very outspoken against Mary. She wanted Henry to do something to force her and Catherine into sort of taking the oath to say the marriage was invalid. But Henry was never willing to push that far with Mary. Despite, Anne's pressuring, which I think says quite a lot about Henry and Mary's relationship. I haven't researched a lot into it, but I think there was something special, a special connection between them, maybe because Mary was the only surviving child for so long.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if because of Catherine's miscarriages, her stillbirths, Mary came along 7 years into the marriage. Whether that formed some kind of, if Henry could form that kind of connection, I think it probably was with Mary.
You would hope so, right? He came from a decent sized family. He had siblings. I'm sure he had a strong bond with Mary. I always wonder, like, what was his bond like with Fitzroy, and what would have happened had Fitzroy lived after Edward, future Edward VI was born? What would that have looked like?
I've been looking at sort of some of the possibilities, and it's interesting because I didn't know all that much about Fitzroy's sort of life, to be honest, before I started working on this book. And there was actually a suggestion to make Fitzroy King of Ireland at one point.
Oh,
which I found really intriguing to think about. I mean, it came to nothing, but yeah, there were definitely suggestions that Henry was sort of trying to bulk up Fitzroy and possibly make him more acceptable as a potential heir, as a backup in case he didn't have a son. But then, of course, we have Fitzroy dying not long after Anne Boleyn, so we don't know what his position would have been like had he still been alive when Prince Edward was born.
And that's so interesting, because now that I'm thinking about that, if that's the case, if he was trying to make him the King of Ireland, then it almost seems like he was using Fitzroy like he would a daughter. Where can I place this child to help bring more power to the English throne?
Yeah, because we know Ireland was slightly chaotic and, across the whole Tudor period. We have a lot of rebellions and, nobles arguing. So, yeah, I hadn't heard that before, but yeah, it's an interesting thought to think that his illegitimate son, he wanted to make King of Ireland. His legitimate son would be Prince of Wales, but his illegitimate son, he wanted to make a king.
Yeah.
Just seems inexplicable somehow. But, so I've been trying to muddle through that and try and figure out what was Henry trying to do with this.
Yeah, well, I guess
I think it was that he was trying to just build up his sort of position just in case, as a backup.
Yeah.
And then even if Henry had a legitimate son, his illegitimate son still had control of Ireland and hopefully would be loyal to the legitimate son as king in future. Although whether he would have been, who knows?
Yeah. I guess I would want to know what Henry's view on Ireland was at the time. If he thought, Ireland was like, no big deal. I'll send Fitzroy up to Ireland to be king because it's just Ireland.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about the sort of Irish politics of the time, but I know, there were multiple rebellions and different things happening. So perhaps having a symbolic figure out there would have helped to quell it. I mean, I imagine he would have had a guiding council and, other people who would actually be implementing things until Fitzroy came of age. But it's definitely an interesting thought.
Yeah. Oh, this topic is like, it's just such a big topic too. And I feel like we just scratched the surface today, but you said you've been researching this for quite a while for your book. So this is your opportunity now, Helen. Why don't you go ahead and pitch your book and let everybody know when it's coming out and where they can find it?
Yeah, well, my book, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, comes out at the end of July. We're looking at the 31st of July. It's currently available for pre-order all the usual places, I think, now, or you can order direct from my publisher. So I'm currently working on a book on the Great Matter, which is due out sometime in 2026. I don't have a date yet because I haven't finished writing it. So yeah, that's a work in progress at the minute. I'm about 2/3 of the way through.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm not giving too much away, but there's some interesting documents and things that I'm reading that I haven't read before. No doubt other people will have, but hopefully I'll give a new look at it, which is interesting because there's a lot to get through. There's a lot of political machinations and different relationships to try and untangle.
I can only imagine. I love that. I love that you came on today to talk about the great matter. It's so fresh in your mind with your research.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely going to have you back to talk about the many faces of Anne Boleyn too, because how can we not?
Yeah.
That's going to be a must. So within the next couple of months here, I definitely have to have you back on the show to talk about her.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited for it coming out, but I'm also quite nervous. It's the book I've always wanted to write, but it never quite felt like the right time.
Yeah. Well,
And now I've
now.
done it.
Yes, I'm excited to see it too. So, Helen, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about the great matter with us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.